On this Saturday night, 2-year tribute. Canada's bold backing for Ukraine on the 2nd anniversary of Russia's invasion.
Canada will be there alongside our allies for the long term.
Trudeau's surprise visit to Ukraine strengthening Ottawa's commitment with a high-stakes security package as fighting rages on. Gaza's grim reality.
The need for an immediate ceasefire.
The deepening desperation as safe zones vanish and aid dwindles. Plus, hopes of a breakthrough in ceasefire talks. South Carolina showdown. Nikki Haley takes on Donald Trump in a heated Republican primary. New lives with old wounds.
It's like a nightmare.
Ukrainian refugees reflect after fleeing to Canada.
Global National with Farah Nasser. Reporting tonight, Neetu Garcha.
A somber service marking the 2nd anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. World leaders, including Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, standing side by side in Kyiv in solidarity with Ukraine's wartime leader Volodymyr Zelensky, laying flowers in honor of the grave sacrifices made by soldiers and civilians.
Your fight is our fight. You are fighting for your sovereignty, for your territory, for your language, for your culture, for your democracy, but also for our democracy. Just like what happened on this very ground 2 years ago. Do перемоги, slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini, which means glory to Ukraine. Good evening and thanks for joining us. Poignant and powerful messages from the Prime Minister on what is a pivotal moment for the people of Ukraine. Today, Justin Trudeau condemned Russia while reaffirming Canada's commitment, pledging new funding to fortify Ukraine's military and its ailing economy. A new $3 billion security package unveiled, billed as much-needed financial and military support for the war-torn country. Our Crystal Goomansingh is in Kyiv to mark the 2nd anniversary of Russia's war and brings us more on what officials are calling a historic new security pact. Crystal?
Neetu, this is a long-term agreement that will see Canada and Ukraine working together on projects today and into the future. While Canada has been supporting Ukraine as it works to retake its territory from Russian fighters, this agreement will also see Canada support Ukraine should there be an escalation or any new acts of aggression. Journalists weren't allowed in the room for what was billed as a historic signing, but the key players who have been in regular contact for the past 2 years were all smiles for their official government photographers. On the 2nd anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion, Canada became the 6th nation to answer Ukraine's call for a security agreement. Can you tell us, please, what's in the Canadian agreement that's concrete that will allow you to accomplish your goals?
I can say that all those agreements are different, but all of them make Ukraine stronger. I would very much want Canada to help us recover one of the dams. As you know, Russia has ruined.
The agreement comes with just over $3 billion in support this year. The West has been keeping Ukraine's economy afloat during the war while equipping it for battle. That support and unity on full display as Canada and European partners visited Hostomel Airport. It's not far from the capital, and on day 1 of the invasion, Russia attempted to take it and set up an air bridge. An intense fight followed, and Russia eventually suffered its first strategic loss, ultimately protecting Kyiv. Every day since, Ukraine has asked for more weapons and more technology to repeat the victory of Hostomel, but deliveries have not kept pace with the intensity of the war. Mr. Prime Minister, if you could please, you just heard the President talk about the importance of timely delivery of weapons. Canada has made many announcements in terms of military delivery, as the President just mentioned, is something he's concerned about. Tell me, please, how are soldiers on the front line supposed to defend their nation with Canadian paper?
We've been sending military equipment, from the very beginning as well, and we will continue to. Vladimir talked about drones and armored vehicles, and we will be doing more. We're also working with allies on issues like delivering NASAMS, which we know is so necessary.
Last year, Canada announced it would purchase an American-made National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System, a critical piece of defense equipment costing more than $400 million, with no expected delivery date. As for drones, a big announcement was made by the Minister of National Defense recently for hundreds with special night vision capabilities. But funding for those was announced last year, and they won't be delivered until April.
We will always be very quick to send whatever we can as quickly as we can.
Equipping Ukraine will only become more difficult the longer this war lasts. That being said, G7 nations met virtually on the second anniversary and once again proclaimed their support of Ukraine, saying Ukraine has proven that Russia can be defeated in battle. Neetu?
Crystal Goomansingh in Kyiv tonight. Thanks, Crystal. Today's NATO chief said it's only a matter of time until Ukraine becomes a member of the alliance.
President Putin started this war because he wanted to close NATO's door and deny Ukraine the right to choose its own path. But he has achieved the exact opposite. Ukraine is now closer to NATO than ever before. Ukraine will join NATO. It is not a question of if, but of when.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says support for Kyiv will not waver and paid tribute to the thousands of Ukrainians killed since the outbreak of the war. Ukrainian civilians have paid a heavy price since the outbreak of the war. In the first year of fighting, more than 8,000 Ukrainian civilians died. A year later, the number of dead rose to more than 10,000 civilians, with nearly 20,000 others injured. And later in the newscast, Heidi Petrachik speaks with some Ukrainians who fled to Canada as they reflect on 2 years after Russia invaded their home country. Since the start of the war, the federal government has committed more than $13.3 billion in funding support to Ukraine. That funding includes more than $4 billion in military assistance donations. The Canadian Armed Forces have trained approximately 40,000 Ukrainian military and security personnel since 2015, after Crimea was annexed. And since the start of 2022, Canada has committed more than $352 million in humanitarian assistance, including 20 cargo flights to Ukraine. As the war rages on, some are questioning the amount of money Ottawa is spending on Ukraine. Our Mercedes Stevenson spoke with retired General and former Canadian Chief of Defence Staff Rick Hillier about the government's commitments.
Neetu, on the grim 2-year milestone of the war in Ukraine, the conflict is entering a precarious phase for Ukrainians, and the risk of war fatigue in Western countries is real. On this week's The West Block, I sat down with Canada's former top soldier, retired Chief of the Defence Staff Rick Hillier, who says the war is at a crucial point.
The war and Ukraine itself is at the most fragile, most vulnerable period during this past 2 years. Their morale is sagging, certainly, as they see them disappear from the headlines in the West. This could go really badly, very quickly, and there's not much the West can do about it in that short term, except give the munitions and the things that Ukraine needs to fight those Russians.
General Hillier says critics of the money Canada is spending on Ukraine need to see the bigger picture.
We're defending ourselves by helping Ukraine, without question, in my view. Just think of the chaos of 40 million people on the move as refugees. And when the world's destabilized, it's bad for Canada, it's bad for our economy, it's bad for our nation, and we pay a huge, huge price. But all those things will be handled by other nations, and Canada will be irrelevant to the solution in any of them.
Hillier also weighs in on the state of Canadian defence and security, warning that we're at risk of becoming irrelevant, and says the military needs more money quickly. We'll also sit down with a former senior Canadian spy to talk about the risk of insider threats to national security and rising concerns that crowds in Canada could be targeted for terror attacks, spawned by the rhetoric around the strife spilling out of the Israel-Hamas war. Neetu?
Mercedes Stevenson in Ottawa. Thanks for that, Mercedes. Developments tonight surrounding the death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Today, Navalny's body was handed over to his mother. In a statement, Navalny's team confirmed the news and thanked everyone involved, adding a funeral is still pending because of the possibility of Russian authorities interfering in how it's carried out. Navalny's body had been held since his death last week. His mother said Friday that she was being pressured into a secret funeral before the release, with Russian authorities threatening to bury Navalny in the remote prison colony where he died unless she agreed. Reports tonight about significant progress being made in those ongoing ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas. Israeli media says the nation's war cabinet is meeting tonight to consider a proposed framework that would see a 6-week pause in fighting and dozens of captives and prisoners freed on both sides. The details are far from settled, but as Mike Drolet reports, a deal can't come soon enough for millions still stuck in Gaza who are increasingly struggling to survive.
4.5 months after Israel began its campaign to destroy Hamas, there are few, if any, safe areas within the Gaza Strip. And if aid for displaced civilians was dire before, it's now reached the point of desperation. Earlier this week, a shipment of flour led to chaos on the ground. When the alternative for some Palestinians is mixing animal feed with weeds, nothing is considered waste. Not even flour spilled into the sand. This refugee says she hasn't been able to get milk since before the invasion, and her kids are now anemic. The aid she and Gaza's 2.2 million inhabitants need isn't far away, but it's out of reach on the other side of the fence.
It is encouraging to see this aid making its way to the desperate civilians in need in Gaza.
Ahmad Hussein, Canada's Minister of International Development, was in the Middle East this week to try to get the humanitarian aid moving. Airdrops, he said, should be considered because the UN reports an average of 62 trucks have entered Gaza each day over the past 2 weeks, far less than the 500 needed. Complicating matters, Israeli protesters have begun blocking border checkpoints in an effort to pressure Hamas to release hostages. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has released his day-after plan for Gaza that would see complete Israeli control over security in Palestinian areas, which experts say would lead to more conflict.
There are two things true here at once, that these security measures are needed to protect Israel, and that these security measures are going to make it harder to ever reach a two-state solution and are going to foster more extremism in the long term. Both of those things can be true.
What's true right now is a flood of aid is needed, and only a trickle is getting in. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
Determined to defeat Donald Trump. Coming up, Nikki Haley's defiant stand on home turf in South Carolina. Why she refuses to quit despite the difficulties. In the U.S., voters in South Carolina headed to the polls today for the state's Republican primary, where the state's former governor, Nikki Haley, faced off with former President Donald Trump. As expected, though, Trump was projected the winner over Haley after opinion polls predicted Haley had little chance against the Republican frontrunner.
I was just informed that we got double the number of votes that has ever been received in the great state of South Carolina. So that's pretty good. So it's a record times 2, and there's something going on in the country. Some really great things are going on.
The former president used his victory speech to promote the Republican Party, saying he's never seen the party as unified as it is right now and calling it an even bigger win than anticipated. Despite the overwhelming results against her, Nikki Haley says she does not believe Trump can beat Biden in the general election, and she is vowing she will stay in the race. The South Carolina primary was the last of the early voting state competitions, which Trump has completely swept. The final vote for the Republican nomination will happen on Super Tuesday on March 5th. Ahead, hunting Canada's remaining Nazis, an inside look at a Global News investigation. This evening, Global News is airing a special program called Rising Hate, Anti-Semitism in Canada. It will explore the dramatic surge in hate crimes here in Canada in the wake of the Hamas attack on Israel and war in Gaza. As part of the program, Global News will also reveal evidence never reported before of Nazi war criminals living here in Canada. Jeff Semple joins us now with a preview. Jeff, what did you discover about suspected Nazi war criminals in Canada?
Well, Neethu, we've been investigating allegations that alleged Nazi war criminals who escaped after the Second World War have been living here for decades, of course, in Canada, including one case where an alleged Nazi was found living in the same Toronto neighborhood as his Jewish victims. I spoke with one of those victims, now 95-year-old Eli Gotz, who was just 13 years old when the Nazis invaded his hometown in Lithuania. Gotz and his parents escaped execution by hiding behind a cupboard in their cellar. Decades later, in 1982, they discovered that one of the Nazis, said to have been responsible for the murder of more than 10,000 Jews in Gotz's hometown in Lithuania, had actually been living in his same neighborhood in Toronto. His name, Helmut Rauka. He lived here in Canada for more than 30 years before he was eventually caught and extradited to Germany to face charges, but he died while awaiting trial in Germany at the age of 74. To this day, Rauka is the only suspected Nazi to ever be extradited from Canada, but our investigation revealed dozens of suspected Nazis are still alive here in Canada, many of them, of course, well into their 90s, living in seniors' homes. But Eli Gotz says that they should still face justice for their alleged war crimes.
The reason it's necessary to do justice is not because of them. They are too old. It's necessary to teach society that you don't get away with it.
On the issue of identifying and prosecuting suspected Nazi war criminals, how would you describe the Canadian government's work and their record on it?
The track record of Canada on condemning the war issues, the war criminals, is very poor.
So as part of this special program this evening, we will team up with a Nazi hunter named Abby Korb to investigate cases of alleged Nazis living here in Canada. And we'll also investigate anti-Semitism, not only past but present, including this recent wave that we've been witnessing of attacks on Jewish communities here in Canada. All of that coming up, Neethu, on this special edition of The New Reality.
All right. Thanks for that insight, Jeff. And as Jeff mentioned, Global News will air that special report called Rising Hate, Anti-Semitism in Canada. You can watch that right here later this evening at 7 p.m. Next, the uncertain future for the Ukrainians who fled their homeland to Canada. Of the millions who fled Ukraine since the conflict began, hundreds of thousands have come to Canada. But for some, the big question is whether they will ever go back. Heidi Petrachik has more on what these Ukrainians are reflecting on 2 years later.
Ludmila Spiridonova left most of her belongings behind when she and her family fled their Odessa home the night she heard explosions 2 years ago.
And then I woke up my family. My husband was sleeping and my daughter was sleeping. I said, something happened. Let's go to our car.
They drove 24 hours to stay with a friend in Portugal. As the war intensified, they heard Canada was offering refuge. They came to Halifax in May of 2022 to start a new life. It hasn't been easy to be here while the war devastates Ukraine.
It's hard, like every day, especially when it's going on in the region where you're from, whereas your family still with friends. It's like a nightmare.
More than 220,000 displaced Ukrainians have arrived in Canada under Ottawa's special immigration measures. Anyone left out of the 950,000 applications approved now has until the end of March to enter the country, causing an uptick in recent arrivals.
People coming now are mostly on their own. They don't have a connection necessarily through friends or family. Their language skills might be a lot lower. There are challenges with finding work.
Organizations from coast to coast have pitched in over the past 24 months to fill any gaps in government supports.
There are three basic things that are missing: childcare, English classes, and jobs. And probably soon it's going to be places to live.
Even so, Ukrainian newcomers say Canadians have made a difference.
I was amazed at how many Canadian volunteers united to help Ukraine and to support us.
What they want more than anything is an end to the war, although Spiridonova isn't sure she could move back, even if that day comes.
A lot of things changed, and to bring everything back, it needs a lot of years.
Knowing the Ukraine she remembers will never be the same. Heidi Petracek, Global News, Halifax.
And that is Global National for this Saturday night. I'm Neetu Garcha. As the conflict rages on in Ukraine, we leave you tonight with a stark reminder of the innocent lives caught in harm's way. Since the start of Russia's invasion 2 years ago, the violence has torn so many families apart, forcing millions of ordinary Ukrainians from their homes or to flee their homeland entirely. Thanks so much for watching.